All right, so we're gonna tonight we are looking at chapter 6 through kind of the beginning of chapter 8. And of course, when we get to chapter 8, we'll talk about why that's another one of these weird verses. I want to actually circle back to a conversation that we had last week about a missing verse 4. And we talked about how it could very easily just be a numbering issue or a monk, kind of whatever. Well, FYI, there's actually a little bit more to it than that. If you look in your Bible, chances are there is actually an asterisk in that area. And it might actually include in the notes the verse 4. And I'm trying to remember, it must have been, was it chapter 5? I think it was the story of the man who was
chapter 5.
Chapter 5. Okay. So the man was laying at the pool, right? He was an invalid, had been ill for 38 years, and he was laying at the pool. The verse that is missing is the verse that says something about how an angel would come and stir the waters.
Okay.
Okay. So that is actually at some point along the way, and we don't know when exactly, and we don't know who or why, but at some point that verse was added. Maybe as a note of explanation, I don't really know. But as earlier and earlier manuscripts have been found, that verse is not included in those earlier manuscripts. So it's a great reminder for us that we are reading something that is not firsthand. We do not have John's original gospel. So what we have is a translation of a translation of a manuscript of a manuscript. And so we're always learning about the language. It's why there are new translations that come out every few years, because people have learned through finding other manuscripts and whatnot, that this particular verse is not included in the earliest manuscripts of John's gospel. And so if you have kind of a more modern translation and more modern Bible, that verse gets pulled out and kind of stuck in the footnotes. It doesn't go away necessarily, but it's kind of marked as FYI, this one isn't kind of part of the original. So anyway, that's the story behind the verse 4. And when we get to chapter 8, we're going to have another instance of not just a verse, but an entire story that actually gets added somewhere along the line. It wasn't actually in the oldest manuscripts that we have of John's gospel. So, all right, so let's start with chapter 6. Chapter 6 starts with 2 miracles. One for public consumption, literally, and one for just the disciples. I loved that one of the commentaries that I was reading marked these 2 miracles as one of grace and one of glory. Kind of sounds like the hymn, that one was all about Jesus and his grace, and the other was all about Jesus and his glory. So I put them together, and we've got a really great hymn. But let's look particularly at the feeding of the 5,000, and we're not going to get caught up tonight in a lot of the nitty-gritty phrases, because then we lose our way very easily. I kind of, just like what we've been doing each week, kind of want to pull back a little bit and cover sections and arguments, not just like line by line kind of verse. So feeding of the 5,000, John's version is probably my favorite, because it's got, they find the kid, right? And who knows, did this kid give up his lunch voluntarily, or was he voluntold by the disciples, like, hey dude, give us your food? We don't really know. But John's gospel is the one that includes the kid. This is a miracle story that appears in all 4 gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all include some version of the feeding of the 5,000. Mark loves this story so much that he includes it not once, but twice. He just changes the number of people present. for what it's worth. Um, so it's an important story for all four gospel writers. And I think that one of the reasons why it's particularly important is because it has a lot of our kind of foundational theology about what we believe about communion, about the Eucharist. And so, and really this whole section that we're looking at tonight has a lot of like deep theology of why communion means what it does. I'm very aware that there are multiple denominational backgrounds in this Zoom room. And so we all kind of we come at communion from kind of differing perspectives. But at the same time, on the whole, as Protestants, we're all kind of mostly on the same page. Okay. So, you know, Betty, your Presbyterian kind of beliefs about communion are going to differ slightly from our mom's Lutheran roots and Nancy's Lutheran roots and our Methodist roots. But on the whole, what we're going to talk about tonight kind of applies across the board. So in the Synoptic Gospels, in this like feeding of the 5,000, we get the foundation of our liturgy for communion. Jesus takes the bread and the fish, but takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it. Those of you who had communion yesterday, that's basically what we do, right? You take, you bless, you break, and you give. John doesn't actually include that. So John doesn't actually include the liturgy component. What John includes is the saving, like, means of grace component. The idea that doing this, feasting on Jesus as the bread of life, is a life-saving moment for us. So if we only have the Synoptic Gospels, we get from the feeding of the 5,000 and then from their kind of follow-up at the Last Supper, we get Jesus saying, do this in remembrance of me. So we get communion, but we get it as an ordinance. We do this because Jesus told us to, okay? Which is fine. That's actually the roots of the Baptist understanding about why we have communion. We do this because Jesus told us to, okay? So it's an ordinance. When you put John's gospel in the mix, you get communion as a means of grace. Because it's John that kind of puts some theology around communion, which is ironic given that John doesn't actually talk about this in the Last Supper. He really only talks about it here in chapter 6 and into chapter 7. So this is John's kind of Eucharist theology. And so we got to kind of break it down a little bit because it's important. I don't want to just like skip over Jesus walking on water, but just to kind of point that out is to kind of skip ahead a little bit. That is it's a theophany, which means it's a divine revelation. It is Jesus saying to his disciples in the middle of this kind of storm when they're freaking out, I am. If you notice, again, I'm jumping ahead, but if you notice in verse 20, Jesus says to him, it is I, do not be afraid. That English translation doesn't do justice to the fact that what Jesus does is in the middle of the storm walks up and says, I am. Which, if you are a disciple who understands that statement as being a declaration of Jesus as God, then the statement, do not be afraid, is kind of like, thanks for nothing, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to be slightly afraid, right? Because God has just walked up on the water. So it's kind of funny that Jesus turns around and says, don't be afraid. Because if they knew what was good for them, they would be a little bit afraid. So just that's that story. I want to kind of set that aside. we can talk about it later if you want to, but there's not really that much more to say. Instead, I really want to kind of go from the feeding of the 5,000 into Jesus talking about being the bread of life. You'll notice in verse 4 of chapter 6 that John makes the statement that the Passover was at hand. So it's not a Passover, like this isn't happening at the same time as the Passover, but John just gives us this kind of statement that the Passover, the feast of the Passover, is near. Why does John tell us that? It really doesn't have anything to do with us kind of marking the calendar. John wants us to pay attention to the Passover themes, the Exodus themes that are very much a part of this story, and then Jesus's explanation of this story. John, more than any of the other gospel writers, makes this huge connection between what Jesus is doing and saying here and the Exodus story, specifically the manna in the wilderness. So let's think back to Numbers. I know we've all spent a lot of time reading through Numbers. Super fun book. Yeah, ironically, a really fun book full of a lot of great stories that get lost because it also includes like the list of genealogy, like the list of numbers, at which point we want to like die. So we stop reading. But Numbers does have some kind of fun stories, including how the Israelites who are wandering in the wilderness are hungry. They're grumbling against God. God sends bread in the form of manna. We don't really know what manna is because it really only existed while the Israelites were wandering in the desert. But we know that it was a bread-like substance that came from heaven. God sent it every day, along with quails. And there were simple rules about it, which was gather what you need for your family for that day. If you gather any more than that, it's just gonna, by the next day, it's gonna be disgusting. The only exception to that rule was before the Sabbath. So before the Sabbath, you gathered enough to get you through the Sabbath, and then you'd have enough to last. It's important to kind of keep that story in mind as Jesus kind of goes through his "I am the bread of life" kind of statements. So the feeding of the 5,000, that miracle is what kind of gives us the foundation for what Jesus is about to talk about. Same kind of cycle that we saw last week: miracle followed by discussion, followed by controversy, followed by more discussion. There's a lot of discussion in John's gospel, and I'm not convinced that the discussion actually helps the controversy. I think it usually makes it worse. But that's kind of it, we're following that same kind of pattern. Jesus, you will notice, reminds or tells the disciples to make sure that they gather up the leftovers. Don't let anything go to waste. That's a manna reference, right? Don't let anything go to waste. We're gonna take what we need and only kind of what we need. It's also kind of harkens back to the Jesus changing water into wine, and this being a miracle of abundance, like in the abundance of God. Remember, we talked with the changing water into wine about how to a certain extent, those two miracles, the water to wine and the feeding of the 5,000, are what John gives us in terms of communion. Without actually telling the Last Supper story, John gives us these two miracles, which for the church that is reading John's gospel, who were already practicing communion on a regular basis, in part because Jesus told them to. John's gospel, without like explicitly telling them to do this, actually tells them why they're doing this. And he is drawing these kind of great connections with this abundant grace, this overflowing grace of God. So the people eat, they eat their fill, everybody goes away happy. They have seen the sign, but they are still paying attention to the sign itself, to the miracle itself, and not to Jesus. And that's his frustration across the board. We've seen it already. His frustration with the Pharisees, his frustration even with his own disciples. They're paying more attention to the miracle and not to the miracle worker. And Jesus doesn't want, I mean, that's the wrong thing, right? They should be paying attention instead to Jesus. All right, skipping the walking on the water and moving to verse 22 and into the kind of the following day and the ramifications of Jesus's action. Remember, the walking on the water was a sign that was done in private, right? The crowds didn't witness that. So they're really only thinking about that feeding of the 5,000. So they show up, they being the crowds, show up and they want some more. They want some more explanation, they want some more signs, they want some more bread. And they start questioning Jesus. And Jesus pushes back. And there's this whole thing about we want another sign. Well, show us a sign. Well, Jesus kind of says, I've been showing you signs and you're not getting it because it's not about the signs, it's about me. But he says in verse 31, and he's already kind of been referring to this already, but our fathers ate manna in the wilderness. And he reminds them that that manna in the wilderness came not from Moses, but it came from God. It came from above. Who else comes from above? What else comes from above? Jesus, right? He's been saying all along, I descended. Moses ascended, I descended. And so again, this idea that the manna descended from God, like Jesus. He is making very explicitly kind of clear connections between himself and this manna, this bread from heaven. So again, the crowds kind of miss the point. And we've seen this throughout John's gospel, right? Jesus is talking on one level, the crowds or Nicodemus or the woman at the well or the disciples, whoever, are only seeing kind of another level. They can't quite get on the same page. And so this is the point where Jesus kind of comes out and says, I am the bread of life. This is the first I am statement in John's gospel, in the sense that it's the first time that Jesus says, I am, and then finishes the sentence. We've seen already numerous occasions where Jesus actually says, I am. He said it to the woman at the well. He said it just a few verses beforehand when he was walking on water. We've seen this kind of self-revelation of I am. But in John's gospel, in addition to kind of the clear signs, there are these clear statements of I am something. And in every one of them, Jesus fills in that blank with something that is common, everyday language, something that has a deeper meaning, that's something that people would kind of immediately understand. So things like, I am the bread of life, I am the shepherd, I am the gate, I am the light, all of these kinds of very common everyday things. That's what Jesus uses to kind of fill in these sentences. And this is the first one. So if you're taking notes along the way, this is a great time to just kind of mark it and keep track of the I am statement. So I am the bread of life. Verse 38, I have come down from heaven. So again, where does this bread come from? like the manna in the wilderness, it comes from God. But like the Israelites who received the manna from heaven, this gift from God, what does verse 41 tell us about how people responded?
They complained.
They grumbled. They grumbled and complained. I love that word. I don't know what your translation uses, but grumbled is what mine says. It's a great word. And it perfectly describes kind of both the crowds that we are seeing here in John's gospel, but it also very much describes a generation of Israelites in the wilderness. So again, thinking back to Numbers and Deuteronomy and those stories, that generation that was freed from slavery wandered in the wilderness because of their grumbling. That's what got them stuck in the wilderness in the first place. And sure enough, they received manna every day faithfully from God and still managed to grumble about eating the same stuff every day. It wasn't good enough for them to have heavenly bread. They wanted, I don't know, cinnamon rolls every so often or something, random. They just got tired of the same old stuff. And so they routinely found something to grumble about. And it is that grumbling that basically led to them dying. God kind of says, enough, you're not going to see the promised land. And that generation dies before they actually enter the promised land. So when Jesus starts talking about how, your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died, that's what it means. So it's important that John kind of records for us the reactions of the crowd. They're grumbling. John's already kind of drawn us as readers into these stories as kind of a parallel. You want to be reading the story of the manna and the Exodus in the wilderness alongside kind of the feeding of the 5,000 and what Jesus is saying here, because the parallel moments are incredibly important. So the same people, right? They're doing exactly the same thing. They've received manna from heaven, in this case, Jesus. And what are they doing? They're grumbling. So guess what? They're not going to receive new life. They won't actually kind of see, therefore, the promised land is ultimately what Jesus is kind of accusing them of. The other really kind of important things about this section in John's gospel. First, and this is for us Methodists in particular, this is a really great reading about how, and this is a really great reading about where John Wesley's understanding of prevenient grace comes from. So thinking about your kind of Methodist understanding of grace, we have prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. Wesley understood prevenient grace to be this idea that God is at work in every person, everywhere, at all times, whether that person acknowledges that grace or not. God is at work. Justifying grace is the grace that kind of sets us right. And somewhere in between prevenient grace and justifying grace, we have a choice to make. And that's the gift of free will. It is a gift from God. But we do actually have to make a choice. What Jesus is talking about here is this idea of God has gifted us Jesus. And at some point, people are actually gonna have to choose to believe or to not believe. But the gift itself comes first. And so this kind of passage is a great kind of underpinning to Wesley's understanding of prevenient grace. So I just, FYI, kind of mark this as, it's not the only place in scripture that kind of gives us an idea of prevenient grace, but it's a good one for kind of understanding how that works. The other kind of critical thing here, and this is that as we move toward like verse 50 and onward, To a certain extent, John's audience changes to the point that John is now not so much telling us what Jesus's original hearers were thinking, but instead John is writing to his community of faith. And we're going to see this more and more, particularly in next week's reading, where what we're reading is more about John's community, which is why it's kind of important for us to remember who we're talking about. So we're talking about an early church. We're talking about a church that is being kind of cast out of the synagogues. And so it's a reckoning point for the early Christians to have to kind of figure out what their identity looks like, because now it can no longer be tied up in kind of being Jewish and Christian. So there's a lot of upheaval in that, and John is kind of speaking into that. And so again, he is speaking to a community that is practicing communion on a regular basis. Probably every time they gathered, they are breaking bread together. They are kind of sharing in the Eucharist together. And so this whole passage of John kind of writing about Jesus as the bread of life and whatnot is an important kind of underpinning for that community, and understanding why they're doing what they're doing and why it's incredibly important. This is the point where, right, in verse 54, whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. The sense of communion as being life-giving, of it being a kind of a true sacrament. And again, that is to a certain extent missing from the Synoptic Gospels. So it's a great reminder why it's important for us to have all four, and not just one or one or two, but all four of them kind of together give us a foundation. This talking about Jesus and his flesh gets a little bit weird, right? Like it sounds weird, right? Like eating Jesus's flesh. It kind of makes us squirm a little bit. But it's also important for us to remember that in John's day, when he's writing this gospel, there are some very real controversies in the early church where there are groups of Christians that are denying the actual humanity of Jesus. They're denying that. So they think he looked like a human, but was always just 100% God. They were called the Gnostics. That's random trivia for you. I mean, you don't have to know that, but it is kind of important for us to know that while the Bible was being written, while the Bible, like it was all one book, but while a lot of these New Testament books are being written, that is a very real situation that the church is dealing with, this kind of wrestling with who is Jesus. How was he kind of fully human and fully divine? Because what's the issue if Jesus isn't also fully human? If he's only divine and not at all flesh and blood, what's the issue? What's at stake? The crucifixion.
If he's divine, then the crucifixion is like magic. It's puff.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. He doesn't actually suffer. He doesn't actually die. And that's not cutting it. So the Gnostics are ones who kind of deny some of that. And so it's up to some of the early writers to address this controversy. And so to a certain extent, chapter 6 is John addressing that. So when he kind of repeatedly talks about Jesus's flesh, John's already kind of given us in the prologue, the word became flesh. The word didn't appear to be flesh, the word became flesh. John wants us to kind of see that. And so again, we're kind of getting that, John's kind of hammering that home, and it really has to do with that kind of, with what John's dealing with in his own kind of community of faith and what he's trying to kind of work out with them. This conversation about the flesh and the spirit and being born of flesh and spirit and whatnot should kind of connect us back to this conversation with Nicodemus. Like Nicodemus, the crowd doesn't understand anything beyond kind of the literal surface level. So what they think they know is possible. Nicodemus was never willing to kind of go beyond what he thought he knew. And the crowd is the same way in this point, or in this part. Jesus is talking about the possibility of new life that is possible in flesh and spirit. But in order to kind of get there, one has to be willing to expand one's limited understanding of what is possible. And again, thus far, the only person in this gospel who, at least until kind of the end of, this next section, thus far, the only person who's been willing to go with Jesus in this place has been the Samaritan woman at the well. Peter's going to jump in here in a minute, and good for him, but Peter's going to get it, at least for now. But other than that, we're not seeing a whole lot of great positive examples. We're really only seeing kind of the negative examples of those who aren't willing to wrap their head around something beyond. So beginning with verse 60, we have, I think, one of the better kind of passages or better verses in all of John's gospel, when his disciples say, this is very hard, who can listen to it? Because at this point in John's gospel, we're probably all feeling this exact statement. This is really hard. How are we supposed to do this? I don't know who this disciple was, but I get it. I get where this guy's coming from. But we see in this kind of following passage, right? These are the disciples who have seen Jesus perform some serious signs, and they've heard him say some pretty serious things. And we've reached a reckoning point. And it's important for us to see it's not just the random crowds that have a hard time accepting and believing in Jesus. It's actually his own disciples who are struggling with it. So his disciples kind of say, this is hard. How are we supposed to get this? And by verse 61, Jesus knows that they themselves are grumbling. We've already kind of made that connection, what grumbling means, and it's not good. So in this one passage, we see those who are grumbling about Jesus. We see those who turn back, like who literally physically turn away from Jesus, who reject him. And then we have Peter and his confession of faith. Jesus looks to him, looks to the 12 and says, do you want to leave? And Peter says, where else would we go? You have the words of eternal life. And so Peter has this really kind of beautiful confession of faith. But Jesus pushes back and says, that's all well and good, but one of you is going to betray me. So a very wide group of examples of how disciples respond. Rejection, grumbling, betrayal, but also confession. And it's also a really good reminder that like Peter's confession here is going to constantly be tested. He's going to constantly have to kind of keep confessing his faith and professing his faith. It's not just this one-time declaration. Peter's constantly going to be kind of having to adjust and keep up and push the boundaries of his understanding and his belief. So this is a good point for him, but it's not the end of his story either. So we move into chapter 7, and to a certain extent, what we start in chapter 7, we're going to finish next week. So we kind of get started, and then it gets interrupted. We'll talk about that interruption, and then next week we'll kind of finish what happens, because in chapter 7, Jesus is actually going to go back to Jerusalem. Of course, he goes back to Jerusalem on his own terms, on his own schedule. his brothers have said to him, you should go and perform a couple of signs and fix your reputation. Which just goes to show us how Jesus's own family doesn't understand. And to a certain extent, it's similar even to Mary kind of saying to Jesus at the wedding, like, fix this. And Jesus pushing back and saying, it's not up to you. It's not even up to me. It's what my Father wants from me. So again, here, his brothers are kind of pushing him to have, his own agenda, and Jesus is pushing back and saying, it's not my agenda. Nevertheless, by the middle of the feast, Jesus goes to Jerusalem. He goes to the temple. So just a side note, he's here not for the Passover, but for the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. This was one of 3 pilgrimage festivals. So if you lived anywhere relatively close to Jerusalem, you would have ideally gone back to Jerusalem, to the temple, 3 times a year. For Passover, for the Festival of Tabernacles, for Booths, and for Pentecost. Those were the 3 main pilgrimage festivals. Obviously, there are a ton of other festivals through the years, but those were the 3 that you would ideally go back to the temple. It was a harvest festival. It happened in the fall of the year, so kind of appropriate for us right now. And we're going to talk some more about this festival and kind of how it was celebrated next week. A little kind of looking ahead. There's not a ton here that we haven't already really talked about, because it's to a certain extent more of the same. I'm not trying to dismiss it as not being important, but at the same time, like, I'm not really sure what else to say about it that I haven't already said. It's more people kind of demanding signs from Jesus, not getting what they wanted, Jesus kind of talking on one level and the crowd kind of on another level, and them not really figuring out a way to match that. I do want to point out in verse 20, chapter 7, the crowd says to Jesus, you have a demon. In John's gospel, there are no demons, except when the crowd accuses Jesus of having a demon or being a demon. So where we have in Luke and Matthew and Mark stories of Jesus like casting out demons from people, like the great story in Luke about Jesus casting the legion of demons out of this man into the pigs or something like that. We don't get any of that in John's gospel. The only time that you hear somebody talking about a demon is when the crowd is actually referring to Jesus. So maybe a little bit ironic there. So there are questions in Jerusalem, again, about Jesus's own identity. There's a back and forth. We see how things are starting to escalate. So Jesus talking about himself as the bread of heaven really was a kind of a flashpoint that upped the controversy. And when he arrives back in Jerusalem, that controversy kind of grows. We see the Pharisees, and again, in this case, I would translate that more as the opposition, not even Pharisees, because it wasn't all Pharisees, it wasn't all Jews, it was just kind of this group of those who opposed Jesus. And remember, they're opposing him in part because he's threatening status quo, which has a lot of dangers for a lot of people. It was dangerous in terms of their relationship with the Romans, which we'll see when we get to Jerusalem for the final time, but it also threatens their status quo and their own sense of authority and kind of established power. So the Pharisees are frustrated, and there's this back and forth. Jesus talks about himself as, or kind of saying, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. There were 2 main symbols in the Feast of Tabernacles. during the feast, kind of two main symbols for the celebration: water and light. And so it shouldn't surprise us that in the midst of the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus says, if you're thirsty, come to me. So kind of back to the conversation that he had with the woman at the well. But next week, we're going to get him saying, I am the light of the world. So again, kind of playing off of the celebrations going on around him. Jesus is using the things that people are seeing and kind of reimagining them, calling on people to kind of rethink the idea of water and the idea of light. Again, causing more and more division. People are starting to kind of be divided over those who think he might actually be a prophet or might actually even be the Christ, versus those who can't imagine that he could be the Christ and instead find him to be more of a troublemaker and one who needs to be kind of taken care of. So that is only going to grow from here. Again, so next week we're looking at kind of 8, 9, and into 10. By John chapter 12, we are heading to Jerusalem for the last time. And really from chapters 14 on, we're in the Last Supper and the Passion story. So we are not far from that final trip to Jerusalem. So it's important for us to kind of take notice of the fact that this opposition to Jesus is growing and growing. So the last bit of tonight's reading. The earliest manuscripts that again, like I'm the one out there finding manuscripts. The earliest manuscripts that scholars have found thus far of John's Gospel do not actually include 753 through 811. It's kind of this last section and the story of the woman being caught in adultery. That is not actually included in the earliest manuscripts of John's Gospel. Don't know why it got added. Don't know what the purpose of it being added is. I mean, or why somebody felt like it needed to be added right there. We don't really know. Somewhere along the line, it does get added. It does get included in some manuscripts. But as again, just like that random verse 4 that kind of gets left out, modern Bibles, newer translations, newer editions are going to kind of put a little asterisk on this section and say it's not necessarily part of the original, and we need to take note of that. Nevertheless, it's here, so let's talk about it briefly at least. So we have some folks bringing this woman to Jesus, and they want to catch him, and they want to trick him, basically. He's in one of those kind of sticky points where if he says it one way, they can make him seem like a bad guy. Or, if he says it the other way, it makes him look like he's talking against the law. So let's talk a little bit about the adultery and the laws concerning adultery and why the Pharisees are not actually offering a really truthful situation. How many people does it take to commit adultery?
2.
2. Not just the woman, but also the man. In a patriarchal society where a man and a woman's relationship is built entirely on property and the passing down of property, and when it comes to adultery, the biggest problem is actually, obviously it's an issue with the woman, but it's actually a bigger crime for the man who is willing to sleep with another man's wife. Because it's not so much that he's willing to sleep with her, it's that he's messed up his neighbor's property to a certain extent. Like he's stolen from his neighbor. It doesn't, we're looking at her as property because essentially that's how she's treated in this society. So the laws concerning adultery would require The stoning not just of the woman, but also of the man. And again, it would have been a harsher penalty against, like, the man would have taken kind of the brunt of the disapproval, basically, because he actually committed a greater sin by messing up his neighbor's property, for lack of a friendlier way to say that. So notice that they don't bring the man to Jesus. They also don't bring any witnesses. And we've already seen how Jesus himself has kind of said, I can't witness for myself. There have to be other witnesses by rule of law. So the fact that they don't even bring witnesses to this situation just goes to show how much they are just trying to trick Jesus. Because if Jesus says that she should go free, then they could accuse him of not honoring the law. But if Jesus is, kind of is willing to accuse her of adultery and agree to her, to the punishment being carried out, then he looks like a jerk, because it's not just her, and there aren't any witnesses. So they want to trap him. Jesus absolutely refuses to engage in the argument. That's him like writing in the dirt. That's him saying to them, I'm aware of what you're trying to do, and I'm not going to be kind of brought into this. So he turns the tables back on them. And at that point, there's nothing that they can say. And so they just kind of walk away. He doesn't forgive her. He doesn't offer forgiveness to a certain extent. There's no proof that she's sinned, except what the Pharisees have said. He just simply says, don't do it again. And that's the end of that. Again, why that story gets put kind of right there and what it has to do with the rest of the gospel around it, not really sure. When you are kind of looking at the context, it doesn't necessarily make sense. So in a way, it is kind of obvious that it's been stuck in there. But it's there nonetheless. So we're gonna stop there for tonight before we get into the next I am statement. So we'll kind of finish the cycle next week. So we'll finish the Festival of Tabernacles and all of that kind of stuff, and the rest of the controversy and whatnot. Again, it's to a certain extent more of the same, but we do have some important stuff in tonight's reading in terms of communion. So that's a big piece, at least. So questions, comments, thoughts, concerns?
When I read that he was writing in the sand and he did it twice, I was kind of curious as to if he was writing something important, but you explained it that he was just like going la-di-da, I don't really care what you're saying.
Yeah, I think there's some tradition somewhere that actually holds that he was like literally writing their sins down, like kind of naming their sins in front of them. But that would be pure.
I like it better that he was just blatantly ignoring them and what they were saying.
It's literally just him. It is a signal that he is refusing to engage in their trickery, basically. So,
my Bible puts a note at the bottom that he may have been writing the 10 Commandments, which would remind them that they were sinning too.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. He could be writing a whole host of things. The fact that John doesn't include what he wrote means
it's not important.
First of all, John didn't include it in the first place, so who knows? But the fact that they didn't kind of include exactly what he was writing, yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I personally like the idea of him writing down a list of their sins, and maybe he makes it like really specific. I think that would be hilarious, but we don't know that. More likely, it's a sign that he is unwilling to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
It
Well,
would be nice at the end of chapter 6 when Peter kind of stated his faith, or that he believed, if Jesus had kind of given him a, you got it, or, you know,
boy.
you know, some of you are getting it, but it's almost like he didn't even respond to him.
Yeah.
It's something else. He talked about, well, yeah, I know, but.
But
So
one of you is going to betray me.
yeah. The heck with you, Peter.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think that is, I mean, I've said it before, John's not my favorite gospel. And and there are a lot of reasons why. The fact that we keep like in this constant cycle of sign and then followed by pages and pages of discourse and whatever. I mean, that right there is enough to make me not enjoy this gospel very much. But we don't in this gospel get a very friendly Jesus. We get kind of difficult stories. And it's not, I mean, Jesus and the woman at the well is a beautiful story. If you kind of read it carefully. But we don't get a warm and fuzzy Jesus. We don't get that kind of encouraging team leader kind of attitude. And we get it maybe kind of in that final prayer and that final discussion, like when we get to the Last Supper. But you're right. I mean, he just
Wasn't very encouraging.
no, he's real. I mean,
No
he's really
encouragement
not.
for, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, right. We just, John doesn't give us that.
Yeah.
John just doesn't. John doesn't give us a whole lot to kind of grasp hold of. So yeah, no, you're right. And that's just par for the course. That is John's gospel. We don't get those warm and fuzzy moments here. Mark doesn't waste any time on those kinds of stories, so he just kind of like moves along. We get a little bit more in Matthew and especially a little more in Luke, but John gives us just like signs and big I am statements and controversy and whatever. Yeah. So when we get to 14 through 17, we get a little bit more like I've called you friends and washing feet and I love you and like that kind of stuff, that we wait until the end before we get there. So, other questions, comments? I know we're not spending a lot of time looking at like each line, but I think if we tried to do that, we would start dropping like flies, and I might be the first one to drop.
Well, it's so repetitive. It's so repetitive.
Yeah, it is very repetitive, and it's interesting kind of reading through the commentaries and how even the commentators are like, oh, this is a repeat of the last cycle. I mean, they run out of new things to say to a certain extent too. So we're not getting caught up in some of these details because it's not actually worth our time.
Is that account of the adulterous woman in the other gospels as well? It's not, because that's like a pretty, he who is without sin cast the first stone, and it wasn't even in the original.
Yeah,
That's kind of like a big point that people.
I think I'm remembering that correctly, but I'm pretty sure it's actually only in John's gospel.
Really?
And it's not even part of the original, which
Yeah, but it's got it's got something that people like who can't throw a stone.
Right. Matthew gives us the Sermon on the Mount and really kind of hits home the same kind of idea. So Matthew gives it to us just not in a story form. He gives it to us in a sermon form. So the theology is there elsewhere. Just the story itself isn't. So yeah, I mean, I would say that theme is very much present in Matthew's sermon, very much, but not the story itself. Yeah, Yeah.
Well, my daughter taught me into taking a year-long course with her on the Book of John. And you're right, I was almost to the point of hitting my head on the table.
I don't know how you did that.
It was 9 months. And it was just like, I got to the point where I've heard this before.
Uh-huh.
You know, and I
Numerous
was,
times.
but I like this so much better because I thought, when I saw it was gonna be John, I thought, I can't do any more, John. But it's been years, but they just took every sentence and it was
No,
not
it's worth it.
helpful for me.
It's not worth it. It's just not. There's too much of it that's connected back to John's original community that we are not his original community. And so then we're translating on top of translating. Like we're having to kind of, and next week, just because I have been kind of reading ahead to prepare for Wednesday night, I realized kind of next week in particular, if we aren't paying attention to who John's writing to, then that's where we can end up in a lot of anti-Semitic trouble. And so there's too much kind of, he's not the best storyteller in the world. You know, Luke reads better. Gosh, even Mark reads better, which is saying something. So yeah, it's a difficult gospel, and spending 10 weeks on it is probably more than we even should be spending on it.
No.
But it's enough, and then we can cross it off our list and not return to John for a while. Okay, I'm gonna hit